7 years alone had made Clara Whitlock forget what it felt like to be looked at, and then came the sound of hooves in the dust. Somewhere beyond the edge of Sable Rock, where the creek still remembered how to whisper through dust and bone, Clara Mercy Whitlock opened her eyes to a world that hadn't changed in 7 long years. She lay still in her narrow bed, listening to the distant rustle of mesquite branches brushing the side of her cabin. Morning light pushed through the cracks in the shutters like a trespasser too polite to break in. Another day was starting, and she already knew how it would end. She rose and braided her black hair in silence, her fingers moved by memory. The mirror above her wash basin had lost its silver backing in places, turning her reflection into a ghost. That suited her just fine, long ago. Clara had asked her father why the wind out here never seemed to rest. He'd said the desert had a long memory. It kept stories the townspeople wanted buried. He'd died with a broken back in a mine east of town, and her mother hadn't lasted the following winter. Since then, it had been just Clara, her 2 good hands, and the ache that lived in her ribs like a bruise that never healed. She tied her apron, stepping into the small kitchen where a pan of cornbread cooled beside the window. The smell filled the room like kindness she didn't deserve. A simple meal, meant for one, always one. Outside, the sun had begun its steady climb. Ash Creek shimmered beyond the garden plot, its waters low this year. She walked barefoot to the garden and checked on the carrots, brushed red dust from the tomato vines, watered the herbs with quiet care. She did not speak aloud. There was no one to hear her, but sometimes, if the breeze hit just right, she could almost hear a song her mother used to hum while shelling peas by the hearth. Clara never did remember the words, only the lilt of it, half lullaby, half hymn. Sometimes she hummed it without realizing. By mid-morning, she had stitched a hem on Mrs. Sloane's dress and laid it aside. The fabric was a rich violet, too bold for that woman, Clara thought, but maybe color made her feel less brittle. The people of Sable Rock had a way of clinging to things like church etiquette and curtain lace, as if they could tame the wildness pressing in from all sides. She hitched up the mule cart and rode into town, slow, careful to keep her chin lifted, but her eyes low. Dust curled behind the wheels as she passed by the old stage post, long abandoned and leaning like an old drunkard against the wind. Sable Rock wasn't much. One crooked main street, a leaning bell tower beside the chapel, a dry goods store with one cracked window, and the bones of buildings that had once promised more. The saloon had closed during the cholera years, though its sign still hung askew like a memory that wouldn't leave. As Clara entered the store, the bell above the door gave a tired jingle. Judith Sloane, tall and pinched like a clothes peg left in the sun too long, nodded without smiling. "The hem's done," Clara said, lifting the parcel. "Mrs." Sloane took it with a sharp eye, her fingers working the stitches. She murmured, "You do good work, Miss Whitlock." Not Clara. Never Clara. Always Miss Whitlock, as if she were a schoolmarm from back east and not a girl who'd buried her parents by hand. The town didn't shun her out of meanness, not outright. It was more that they didn't know what to do with her. She wasn't married, wasn't soft, didn't chatter at quilting circles or bake pies for the Sunday social. She lived alone by the creek and spoke only when necessary. That made her strange, and strange didn't sit well with Sable Rock. She gathered her few supplies, flour, lamp oil, salt, and gave Caleb Boone, the boy who sometimes ran errands, a brief nod as he tipped his hat. Reverend Pike stood outside the chapel, brushing dust from his sleeves. He offered her a gentle nod, but said nothing. That was fine. Clara hadn't been to church in nearly 4 years. Grief had no place among cheerful hymns and potluck suppers. By the time she returned to the cabin, the sun had settled into the hills like an old man resting his bones. She unhitched the mule, rubbed its ears, and gave it half an apple from her apron pocket. The porch creaked as she stepped onto it, the way it always did, like it sighed beneath her weight. Inside, the silence welcomed her back. She put away the supplies, heated the beans, lit the oil lamp, everything in its place, everything still. And yet, that evening, something tugged at the edges of her thoughts, something unshaped and unfamiliar. She walked down to the creek. The willow trees leaned toward the water, the way mourners lean over graves. She knelt beside the stone she had placed years ago, her mother's name scratched into its face by her father's old knife. She laid her hand against it. "I'm still here," she whispered, "but I'm not sure why anymore." She stood slowly, brushing her palms against her skirts. Her joints ached, not from age, but from loneliness carried too long. She turned to walk back, and then it came, that sound. Distant at first, but undeniable. A steady rhythm on hard-packed earth. Horse hooves. Not the lazy shuffle of Caleb's pony, not the iron clatter of a supply cart. This was a traveler's rhythm, a stranger's pace. Clara froze at the edge of the garden, her eyes fixed toward the horizon. Dust curled faintly in the last light of day. Someone was coming. She paused mid-step. Breath caught. The wind carried something else, now not just the hush of evening, but the approach of change. Her hand found the porch rail as her eyes searched the horizon again. The first thing she noticed wasn't the man, but the way the horse moved like it had carried grief all the way from the edge of the world. The last of the sun had just dipped below the ridge when Clara saw the figure. Her eyes, sharpened by years of watching the horizon for dust devils or coyotes, fixed on the shape as it emerged from the red haze. Rider and horse, slow but steady, pressing forward as if there was nowhere left to go. But here, she didn't move from her porch, though her needle froze in the fabric of her mending. A dress laid across her lap, the thread still halfway through a torn seam. Wind lifted her hair at the temples, sent it brushing against her cheeks. She squinted into the dusk. The man rode tall, but not proud. He sat the saddle like someone who had forgotten comfort long ago. His broad shoulders leaned slightly forward, the way tired men do when the weight they carry is not on their back, but in their chest. The horse, a powerful black with a fine gait, moved with careful steps as though it, too, understood the long road behind them. Clara had once asked her father what a man looks like when he's lost something he can't replace. He'd said, "You'll know him by the way he looks at the ground like it betrayed him." And this man, as he dismounted by the edge of Ash Creek, fit the answer perfectly. He didn't speak right away. He led his horse to the water, let it drink without rushing. Then, as the sky turned the color of burnt sugar, he reached down and filled a tin canteen, capped it, and only then turned to look at her. They stood maybe 40 feet apart. She sat still in her rocking chair, the porch lamp burning behind her in the window. He studied her as a man might study the weather calm, cautious, and with no expectation of mercy. "Evenin', miss," he said finally. His voice was dry as mesquite bark, with something cracked and weary beneath it. He touched the brim of his hat, not a flourish, just a small, practiced courtesy. "Evenin'," Clara replied. Her voice, though unused to conversation, found its steadiness. He glanced toward the road, then back at her. "I don't suppose there's a place in town a man might find a bit of shelter." Clara hesitated. The town's old boarding house had closed when Elmer Henley died. The inn, 2 days' ride away in Prescott territory, wasn't an option for a man with dust on his boots and sorrow in his spine. She could have said nothing. She could have told him to ask Morton, the stable owner, though Morton had been known to turn strangers away if their coin was thin. But her answer surprised even herself. "There's a barn behind the house," she said. "It's dry. Clean enough." The man didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, not just at her face, but through her, like he was trying to read the spaces between her words. Finally, he gave a short nod. "That's mighty kind of you. I wouldn't want to be a burden." "It's no burden," Clara said. Her fingers, still resting on the fabric in her lap, curled tight without thinking. Her heart had begun to beat in a strange rhythm she hadn't felt in years. "There's a well by the barn," she added, "and I can spare a bit of supper, if you haven't had any." A flicker passed over his features, not quite a smile. Not quite grief, but something in between. "I'd be grateful for both." He stepped forward, reins in hand, the horse trailing behind him with gentle obedience. As he passed under the porch light, Clara saw the dust caked on his boots and coat, the travel-worn lines carved into his face. His hair was dark, hanging just past his collar, and shot through with early threads of silver. He looked to be in his middle 30s, though his eyes, those storm-colored eyes, had seen far older things. "I'm Ellis Boone Callahan," he said, stopping at the porch stairs. Clara Mercy Whitlock. She returned, standing now, the mending set aside. He dipped his head once more, then followed her gesture toward the barn. Clara led the way down the path, the oil lamp she carried casting soft shadows. The barn wasn't grand. It had been her father's workshop once, and later a storage place, but it had fresh straw, and the scent of cedar wood still lingered in the beams. Ellis unsaddled his horse, Thunder. He called him with quiet efficiency. His hands, rough and steady, moved over the animal with care that said more than words. He rubbed its flanks, murmured low, unreadable sounds as he checked its hooves and gave it a rub-down with an old cloth. "He's beautiful," Clara said, unable to stop the words as she stood by the doorway. "Name's Thunder," Ellis said, patting the horse's neck. "Had him for years now. He's the only soul who's seen everything and still sticks around." Something about that stirred something tight in Clara's throat. She turned and gestured toward the well. "You can wash up there. Supper'll be ready when you come in." When he stepped into her kitchen half an hour later, cleaner, but no less shadowed, she had already set 2 tin plates on the table. Beans, cornbread, a bit of dried venison. Nothing special, but warm. They sat in quiet, the way people do when silence has been their only company for too long. He ate without complaint, as though he'd gone days without a proper meal. "Been ridin' far?" she asked, mostly to hear something besides the wind and the scrape of cutlery. "Far enough," he said, pausing between bites. "Been running from ghosts, I suppose." She didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Sometimes the ghosts follow us, no matter how far we run." He looked at her then, really looked. Their eyes met across the table, and in that still moment, Clara felt something inside her chest shift, recognition, that unspoken, holy ache that said, "I see you. I know what lives in the cracks of your bones." He set his fork down, folded his hands on the table. The lamplight caught the edge of a scar near his wrist, and Clara, despite herself, wondered not just who he had lost, but what part of himself hadn't come back. "What happened to you?" she asked, surprised at her own boldness. Ellis didn't flinch. "I had a wife, Catherine, and a daughter, Emma. Cholera took 'em both. Just last year." Clara didn't ask for details. She only breathed deep and nodded once. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it with a depth that came from someone who knew the raw edges of absence. After supper, Ellis stood by the door, his hand resting on the frame. "Thank you, Miss Whitlock. It's been a long time since anyone showed me such kindness." "You're welcome to stay," Clara said, her voice quieter than before. "As long as you need." His eyes searched hers again, slower this time. "Perhaps I will," he said. "Perhaps I will." And when he stepped back into the dark night, the silence left behind was different than before. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. That night, long after he'd returned to the barn. She lit the lamp again, just to see if its glow might reach the edge of the stable. In the west, storms don't knock, they break the sky wide open like a secret finally shouted. The day had started with a strange kind of quiet, the kind that made the air feel too still, the horizon too watchful. Clara knew that silence well. It was the hush before a storm, the stillness that came when the desert was holding its breath all morning. The sky had gathered weight, building with that copper-colored sheen she had come to dread. By noon, the wind had begun to rise, pushing dust into her eyes as she picked herbs from the garden. She tried to ignore the way her hands trembled when the clouds began to bruise the light overhead, turning it to a sickly yellow. She hadn't spoken of her fear of storms to anyone in years, not since the night lightning struck the roof of their first cabin, sending fire through the rafters and smoke into her lungs. Her father had beat back the flames with an old wool coat. Her mother had screamed her name until they'd found each other through the smoke. Clara remembered the smell of scorched wood and the way her own breath had caught in her chest for days after. It wasn't the rain that frightened her. It was the sound, the cracking sky, the way thunder rolled like God dragging his heel across the earth. It reminded her how small she was, how alone. By late afternoon, she'd tried to lose herself in her sewing, but the wind had begun to rattle the shutters. Her stitches went crooked. The oil lamp flickered even though it was still early. Outside, the trees swayed like they were praying. She stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, and watched the sky turn iron. A low rumble reached her chest before it touched her ears. She flinched. Her hands, so used to steady work, were shaking when the first flash of lightning split the sky. It lit the cabin like a stage. The thunder followed a breath later, sharp and close, and the needle dropped from her fingers with a clatter. She gasped and pressed her hand to her mouth. Then knock, not from her memory, but her door. The sound made her jump again. She rushed to the front room, barely catching the swinging latch in her hand before the next gust hit. Standing there in the doorway, rain streaking down his coat, was Ellis Boone Callahan. His hair was damp, his shirt collar pulled loose, and the look in his eyes said everything before he spoke. "I heard you cry out," he said over the wind. "Are you all right?" His voice steady, but strained was a thread she grabbed without thinking. She reached forward and took his sleeve. "Come in," she said. pulling him inside before she even realized what she was doing. The wind slammed the door behind them. Rain beat against the roof in sheets. The shutters creaked like old bones. "I'm sorry," she said breathlessly, smoothing her damp hair back. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I've always been. I don't handle storms well." Ellis's gaze swept the room, then settled on her face. "You didn't disturb me. I was worried." Another flash lit the room. Thunder shook the air a moment later. Clara winced and turned toward the hearth, hugging herself again. "When I was a girl," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "our cabin was struck. My mother never recovered from the fright. Since then, when it storms like this, I just—" She broke off, embarrassed. Ellis didn't say anything. He simply stepped closer, his boots leaving wet prints on the wood floor. Then, so gently she hardly felt it happen, he reached out and rested his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to face it alone," he said. Clara looked up at him. The lamplight caught the side of his face, and for the first time, she saw something softer than sorrow in him. A warmth that hadn't been there when he first arrived. The wind roared outside. Another burst of lightning flashed, and this time, she stepped forward without thinking. Her body moved before her mind could stop it. One breath, two. She pressed against him, her hands gathering the fabric of his shirt, her cheek resting just above his heart. And then she felt it. His arms, strong and slow, wrapped around her. For the first time in her life, Clara was being held, not out of obligation, not because she was broken, but because someone had chosen to. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her eyes stung, but she kept them closed, breathing in the scent of rain and horse and faint cedar soap. Ellis didn't move, didn't speak. He simply held her while the storm flung itself against the world outside. Time passed, but it had no name in that moment. Her pulse slowed. The noise outside dulled, and inside that silence, Clara became aware of something more than fear, more than grief. She became aware of him, not just his body, but the quiet way he breathed, the tension in his spine, the way his fingers rested lightly against her back like he didn't want to break her spell. She tilted her head back to look at him. He looked down at her. There was tenderness in his eyes, but also something she hadn't seen there before. Hope. "Clara," he said, her name coming out like it wasn't meant to be spoken but prayed. She didn't know who moved first, but a moment later, his mouth brushed hers, hesitant and warm, like he was asking a question. She answered with a kiss that came from somewhere deeper than thought, from the ache that had lived inside her for years and had finally found something to reach for. It was her first kiss, and she understood, with sudden clarity, why people spoke of love like it was a wildfire, a flood, a storm. Because it broke you open. It made you feel every edge of your skin. When they pulled apart, her breath came fast and uneven. Ellis kept his hands on her arms as if afraid she'd vanish. Outside, the storm had begun to soften. Rain now fell in long, even strokes. Thunder wandered off like it had lost interest. Ellis glanced toward the door, then back at her. "I should go," he said, but his arms didn't leave her. "This isn't I don't want to take advantage." "You're not," Clara said, her voice quiet but sure. "Please, don't go. Not tonight." For a moment, neither of them spoke, and then his expression softened into something that almost smiled. "All right," he said, "I'll stay." They sat by the hearth as the storm waned, the oil lamp throwing long shadows. Clara, wrapped in a shawl, leaned into his side while he stared into the embers. Their conversation was soft, unhurried. He told her about his daughter, Emma, how she used to sing to the trees and insist on sleeping with her boots beside her pillow in case a fox came to visit. Clara listened, heart aching and full at once. She told him about her mother's rose soap, the one scent that still made her cry when she smelled it at the general store. Outside, the wind faded. The night deepened. Inside, the silence was no longer frightening. Clara rested her head against Ellis's shoulder. Her eyes grew heavy. Sleep, he murmured into her hair. I'll keep watch. And for the first time since she was 16 years old, Clara fell asleep in someone's arms, warm and safe beneath the quiet hush of a storm that had finally passed. But peace, she'd learned, rarely lasted long in a place like Sable Rock, and when her lips found his, she wasn't thinking of sin or scandal, only this, how still the storm had become inside her. In small towns, silence isn't absence, it's gathering, like the sound before a bullet finds its mark. The sun was already high over Sable Rock when Clara stepped down from her wagon onto the dusty main road. Her boots crunched over the gravel like the slow creak of an old door. The town looked the same as it always had, tired, sun-bleached, and squinting against its own stubbornness. But today, it felt different. The wind was watching, the windows peeking, and behind every still door frame lay a pair of ears listening too close and too long. After the storm, 3 days had passed, calm and uneventful. But it hadn't stayed quiet in people's minds. Clara could feel it now, the weight of it. Not a storm of weather this time, but of words, glances, the invisible line drawn between the familiar and the judged. She held her head steady as she walked. Her hands gripped the basket on her hip. Inside were thread spools and new needles. Business, she told herself. Nothing more. As she entered Judith Sloane's store, the little bell gave its usual dry chime, but no warm greeting followed. Mrs. Sloane stood behind the counter, fingers busy folding muslin. She didn't look up. Clara set the basket down, clearing her throat softly. I came to pick up the linen bolts you ordered last week. Still no eye contact. They're on the back table. Her voice was clipped, shorter than usual. Clara made her way to the back, feeling the space around her stretch wider, emptier. She collected the fabric, heart thudding slow and low like a warning drum. When she returned to the counter, Judith's eyes finally lifted, but they didn't meet hers. Folks are talking, she said flatly. Not that it's my business, but it's a small town. Miss Whitlock. Clara held the gaze now. Steady. People have always talked. I've lived with their silence just as fine. Silence is one thing. But a man sleeping on your property, well, that's a louder kind of quiet, wouldn't you say? Clara didn't flinch. She paid for her fabric and left without another word, her boots striking sharper than before as she crossed the street. On the chapel steps, Pastor Pike stood dusting his sleeves, watching her. He didn't wave. By the time she reached her wagon, she saw Dr. Ezra Bram approaching, his hat in one hand and his weathered face lined with concern. Clara, he said gently, might I speak with you a moment? She paused, keeping her voice polite. Of course, Doctor. He stepped closer, glancing about before speaking in that soft, careful tone she remembered from her mother's sickbed. I won't judge your decisions, but you should know. People here, They've got strong notions about how a woman should carry herself. Clara lifted her chin. And what would you have me do? Turn him out because of whispers? I'd have you think about your reputation. I know this town. They won't say much to your face, but they'll lock their doors behind your back. Stop bringing work. Stop inviting you in. They already did that, she said, her voice tight. Years ago. When I was 16 and buried both my parents alone. He blinked but said nothing. I'm not afraid of their silence, Clara added. I'm afraid of losing the one person who's shown me kindness in 7 years. Dr. Bram placed a hand on the wagon rail. I just don't want you hurt. Clara. Not more than you've already been. She nodded once. Neither do I. By the time she reached the cabin, the linen weighed more in her arms than it should have. The sun was lowering behind the bluff, casting long amber streaks through the sky. She set the bolts inside and went to find Ellis. He was at the garden fence, sleeves rolled up, fixing a loose board. His shirt clung to his back, damp from sweat. When he turned and saw her, his smile came quickly, but it faded when he saw her face. What happened? She didn't answer right away. She walked to the porch, set her satchel down, then turned back toward him. They're talking, she said, about us, about you. Me. Ellis's jaw tightened. Let them talk. It's more than talk. It's silence. Work drying up. Neighbors looking the other way. He dropped his hammer and crossed the distance in 3 strides. I can go. If that'll make it right for you. Clara shook her head, eyes bright. Don't you dare, he frowned. I don't want to be the reason they turn on you. You're not, she said firmly. They turned long ago. You're the only one who made the silence bearable. He took her hands now, rough palms enclosing her fingers. Then what do we do? Clara looked up at him, the light of the porch lamp behind her casting a gold ring around her hair. She had never looked more certain in her life. Clara took a long breath. The wind stirred her skirts, but her feet stayed rooted. She'd spent years surviving. Maybe now was time to live. We marry. The word fell like a stone into water, rippling through the air between them. Ellis stared at her. Clara, if they want names and paper to make them feel better about kindness, then let them have it. Let them call it what they need to. I don't care. I want you here. Not in the barn. Not halfway gone. I want you here beside me. As my husband. He looked at her then with such reverence, it nearly undid her. I thought my heart was buried with them, he said slowly. But you're making it beat again. She swallowed hard, nodding, her fingers tightening on his. Then let it beat for something that's real. They stood in silence, thunderless now, but the air around them pulsing with something just as fierce. The garden rustled in the wind. An oil lamp flickered in the window. Thunder was still chewing hay in the barn. The world had shifted. The creek would remember this night. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was only this I thought my heart was buried with them. But you're making it beat again. There's something sacred in simplicity, the kind of wedding where joy comes in quiet looks, not church choirs. In the corner of her cabin, Clara stood barefoot on a linen sheet, a half-finished cream dress pinned along her frame. The soft light of morning filtered through the window, catching motes of dust as they drifted lazily through the air. Hester Langridge circled around her like a quiet storm, fingers working with the careful precision of a woman who had dressed both brides and the dead. Clara hadn't slept much. The night before had carried weight the good kind, The kind that presses on your chest not from sorrow, but from the fullness of change. Her heart, used to stillness, had stirred with anticipation like the stirring of wind across prairie grass before spring bloom. "Stand straight," Hester murmured. "Let me pin this shoulder again." The cream silk had once belonged to Clara's mother, an indulgence never worn, tucked into the bottom of a chest that smelled of cedar and age. She had held on to it through lean years, through loneliness, through fire and storm. And now, today, she would wear it. She'd be proud, you know, Hester added gently. Not looking up, Clara blinked. I hope so. Outside. The wind danced against the windows, rattling the glass like it, too, was ready to bear witness. The church bell had not rung in months, not since the winter funeral of old Sawyer Boone, but it swung gently now as the breeze passed through its bones. The chapel, Ash Chapel, stood just west of town. Its white paint had faded to gray in places. The steeple leaned a little too far, yet it held its place, humble and enduring. Inside the church, Ellis Boone Callahan stood before the altar, his jacket newly brushed, collar pressed against his neck. He had bathed in cold well water that morning, shaved with a trembling hand, and pulled on the best shirt he owned, pale blue. The one Emma had once claimed made him look clean, like Sunday sky. He could still hear her giggle if he closed his eyes. Beside him stood Dr. Ezra Bram, who had offered, without ceremony, to act as witness and steady hand. A man deserves not to stand alone, he'd said. Ellis turned his gaze to the wooden cross above the altar. His hands were folded before him, not in prayer, exactly, but in stillness. He thought of Catherine, of the vows he had once spoken in another church, in another life. That day had been loud, filled with voices, food, laughter. Today was quiet, and yet more holy. Then the door creaked, and in stepped Clara Mercy Whitlock. The entire church, small as it was, felt like it inhaled. She wore the cream dress with a row of small pearl buttons down the back, her hair pinned in a loose coil with desert blooms tucked behind her ear. The bouquet she held, wild sage, yellow columbine, soft desert lupine had been chosen by Hester, gathered that morning before light touched the ridge. Caleb Boone, in his best jacket and with hands that couldn't quite stop fidgeting, had driven the wagon from her cabin. He now stood near the back, eyes wide with the wonder of a boy watching a story unfold. Clara's eyes found Ellis immediately. She didn't glance at the benches or the few townsfolk who had gathered more from curiosity than goodwill. She moved straight down the aisle, each step a vow. Pastor Gideon Pike cleared his throat softly. His voice, when he began, was reverent and plain. We are gathered here, before God and one another, to witness the union of Clara Mercy Whitlock and Ellis Boone Callahan. The vows were short, familiar words worn smooth by time. But when spoken in voices shaped by grief and survival, they rang deeper. Do you, Clara, take this man? I do, she said, her voice calm, unwavering. And do you, Ellis, take this woman? I do, came his answer, rough with meaning. But when Pastor Pike invited them to share their own words, it was Ellis who stepped forward slightly, taking her hands in his. You found me when I was lost, he said, voice steady now. Gave me shelter when I had none, and showed me love still blooms in burned places. I promise to protect you, to build something good from the ashes. Clara, eyes shimmering, replied, You taught me I wasn't meant to be alone forever, that I am seen, that I am enough. I promise to share each morning, each sorrow and each joy with you, to build a home filled with mercy, for both of us. Pastor Pike, silent for a breath, finally smiled. By the laws of this territory, and the witness of this congregation, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Ellis kissed her then, not urgently, not with haste, but with the quiet depth of a man who had known loss and chosen hope anyway. The church echoed with light applause. Even Judith Sloane gave a small nod. Emery Fiddle Grant, who hadn't played in years, lifted his worn instrument and coaxed out a tune as if the strings themselves had waited for this day. Outside, the air smelled of creosote and sun-warmed dust. The wind had settled. Clara and Ellis stood hand in hand beneath the chapel's lean steeple, while Hester hugged her with firm arms, whispering something only the bride would ever know. Back at the cabin, the porch had been swept clean. Thunder snorted softly from the barn, as if sensing something had changed. A meal waited: simple bread, smoked meat, wild berry preserves, enough to share. But for now, Clara and Ellis stood alone beneath the open sky, fingers interlaced, eyes fixed not on what they had escaped, but on what they were walking toward. "I don't need a crowd," Clara murmured, her cheek against his chest. "Just this. Just you." Ellis smiled, brushing his thumb along her jaw. "And I don't need to run any more." That night, as they stood beneath the stars outside the chapel, Clara whispered, "Subscribe to this moment." And he replied, "It's already carved into me." Even in the desert, life insists on blooming, especially where grief once grew. The desert had shifted again, the way it always did in late April, color pressing its way into the edges of everything. Wildflowers crept from beneath rocks where the ground had once cracked open in drought. The air, dry and clean, carried a scent of sagebrush and distant rain, though no clouds shadowed the sky. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin that was now her home, not just the place she slept, but the place she lived, truly lived, for the first time since girlhood. The rocking chair creaked gently beneath her, its rhythm matching the turn of her thoughts. There was a new sound, soft and familiar, coming from the cradle inside the cabin. She could not remember the last time she had known peace quite like this, not the stillness of loneliness, but the hush of something complete. The cabin had changed in small ways: a larger table, a shelf of folded baby quilts, the scent of fresh wood from the nursery Ellis had built with his own hands. He had shaped it with old tools, each cut quiet and sure, carving their future out of cedar beams and memory. Her hands rested across the swell of her stomach, now soft again, empty in the best way. She was still tired from the birth, still sore in places, but her heart had filled with something she didn't yet have words for. Inside, Ellis hummed a tune as he rocked their son, Samuel Boone Callahan, back and forth in the cradle. The melody was quiet and worn, something his mother had sung to him when the night stretched too long. It was the same one he'd hummed under his breath as Clara labored through the storm-dark hours of birth, sweat on her brow, her hand crushing his like a lifeline. The birth had not been easy. It had begun as twilight fell 4 nights ago, just as the wind turned cold and the horses grew restless. Hester had arrived first, steady as ever, her hands washed and ready before Clara could even cry out. "Doctor." Bram followed, sleeves rolled and spectacles perched crookedly on his nose. Ellis had never looked more frightened, not even the day he buried his wife. Not even the day he wandered into Sable Rock with nothing but a name and a horse. He hadn't let go of Clara's hand once. The contractions had come hard and fast, each one a wave that took her breath and left her shaking. She cried out, sobbed once, gritted her teeth, and still she fought, for hours. The room had filled with only her breath, her pain, the words Hester murmured, and Ellis whispering her name like a prayer. When the baby finally arrived, the silence broke with the sound of new life, a cry that pierced through them like morning light. The boy had come into the world screaming, fists clenched, as if he already knew he had something to prove. They had named him Samuel, for no reason they could explain except that when Ellis held him, he said, Samuel, because I was heard. Now, days later, the cries had softened into coos, and Clara had taken to waking in the night just to listen to make sure he was still breathing, still real. She stepped back into the cabin slowly, her fingers trailing the doorframe. The scent of firewood and warmed milk met her, and there he was, Ellis in his undershirt, the sleeves rolled up, one large hand resting lightly on the edge of the cradle. His eyes, full of something raw and radiant, looked up when he heard her. He's almost asleep, Ellis whispered. I reckon he's a fighter, just like his ma. Clara smiled. He's a miracle. Ellis reached for her hand and kissed her fingers, his rough lips brushing the pale gold of her wedding band. He had changed. She had seen it happen, slow and sure. The man who had once held himself together by silence had begun to speak more often, now not in grand declarations, but in the quiet comfort of presence, in the way he turned the soil, in the way he ran his fingers through her hair when she couldn't sleep, in the way he now carved wooden animals for Samuel, small and perfect. I didn't think I'd ever be a father again, he said, watching his son's tiny chest rise and fall. You are, Clara said softly, and you're a good one. He looked down at the child, his voice barely above a breath. When Catherine and Emma died, I didn't bury them proper. The ground was frozen. I wrapped them in blankets and laid stones over them myself. Said nothing. Just walked away. She moved closer, her hand resting on his back. You loved them, she said. That never had to be spoken. He nodded once, then added, but I never told them how much. I thought I'd have time. Clara's throat tightened. You have time now, she said. We do. They stood in silence, the fire crackling low. The baby asleep now, his small hand resting against his cheek like he'd been born into peace. Later, after the cradle had gone still and the windows grew dark with the coming night, Ellis stepped outside. Clara followed, wrapping herself in the shawl Hester had given her on her wedding day. They stood on the porch together, listening to the hush of the land. The same land that had once been cruel and lonely now felt like something alive, something holding them. The stars were beginning to come out, one by one. Ellis leaned against the post, his gaze lost in the dark. I never thought a place like this could feel like home, he said. Clara slipped her arm around his waist, resting her head against his chest. It does now. Behind them, the cabin stood warm and full, no longer just a building, but a life in bloom. Under a velvet sky, the man once lost and the woman once forgotten rocked their son on the porch of a cabin where silence no longer reigned. Out here, when the wind settles down and the prairie hushes like an old hymn, There are stories that still ride between the sage and the stars, and sometimes, if you listen close enough, you can still hear them breathe. Maybe you'll remember the woman who once waited beside Ash Creek, stitching hope into every corner of her cabin, or the man who rode into town with nothing but a worn saddle and a grief too large for words. There's something about a horse's footfall in dry dust that never really leaves your bones. It's the rhythm of coming home, or maybe just finding something worth staying for. The wildflowers still bloom out there, even between stones, and their petals don't ask permission. They just rise, soft and defiant, like memory refusing to die. Old leather creaks in forgotten barns, letters yellow in sunlit drawers, and sometimes a cradle in a quiet room rocks without a sound, as if the past itself is breathing new life. What's lost isn't always gone. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right soul to name it again. The desert remembers everything, but it forgives slow, and so do people. Most times. You can ride 100 miles from sorrow, but it'll still ride beside you until someone reaches across the silence and chooses you anyway. Some folks say justice needs a jury, a gavel, a paper signed in ink. But sometimes it just needs a quiet woman with a backbone of iron and a heart that refuses to give up on humanity. Honor, like old medals tucked in cedar chests, tarnishes but never truly vanishes. There's peace in knowing that even if the town never saw the truth, two hearts did, and that was enough. The chapel doors still groan on their hinges, but they opened for something real that day, something unbreakable. A quilt stitched from loss and mercy warms better than one stitched from pride. There's a kind of redemption that doesn't need applause, just a warm supper and a porch light burning steady. And sometimes, when the last lantern flickers low, it's not regret that fills the room, but a gentle kind of thankfulness for having loved at all. Forgiveness, after all, is just memory softened by time and touched by grace. If you close your eyes tonight, you might still see her there, Clara Mercy Whitlock rocking in the windlight, humming a tune no one else remembers. Or Ellis Boone Callahan, carving wooden toys by firelight, carving love where grief once stood. Maybe you'll think of Hester, hands forever steady, or that dry well that gave back water when someone believed it could. Maybe you'll remember how the storm didn't take the cabin, didn't take the girl, didn't take the chance. Some truths don't need to be shouted, they just need to be held. And if you're still holding them, well, maybe that means you're part of the story too. The Old West ain't just gunfights and gold. It's folks like Clara, like Ellis, like you, doing right by others even when nobody's looking. If you believe that kindness still matters, that honor can bloom again, that love comes late but mighty, then maybe leave a sign. Just one. Type 1 if you still believe in slow justice, in mercy over noise, in the way an oil lamp glows when two people finally stop running. Subscribe to Western Story Chronicles. If you'd like to ride along on the next tale, there's more yet to tell beneath these skies. And as the wind slips past the eaves and the twilight hushes the hills, let this be the kind of story that lingers like a warm cup beside the fire, quiet, steady, and full of something that feels like home.